Hello, this is Christian Perring, and I'm going to be doing what is hopefully a reasonably brief slideshow presentation on ancient Indian philosophy. Now, that's going to be kind of tricky because it includes the beginnings of both Hinduism and Buddhism. So, there's a huge amount to try and include in this. Fortunately, I don't actually know much about it, so I'm just going to be giving you some of the basics, and you'll need to get some of the more kind of detailed parts from elsewhere. Uh, so here we go. Here is what we will aim to cover in this show. Uh, we're going to be doing both kind of moral issues and metaphysical issues, and we'll be seeing some of the links between them. Morality is obviously about how we should live, about what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. Whereas metaphysics is like the ultimate nature of the world, the ultimate nature of the self, um, kind of the deep questions about how the world is in its most true description. And that obviously is going to be a matter of quite a lot of variety of opinions, even within these traditions. We'll be looking at the Vedas and the Upanishads or Upanishads. One thing I should mention is that my pronunciation is probably not that great, but I'm doing my best. And then I will look at a little bit of the teachings of the Buddha, especially the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and the right view, and hopefully that will get us a lot of the way. One of the first collection of texts that are important for Hinduism are the Vedas, and so they form a sort of written basis for Hinduism. Um, they're not clearly authored. They were written over a large length of time. There's clearly different authors were involved in writing it. It was probably in the millennia, maybe the second millennium before the Common Era. And what the Vedas are, they're just kind of hymns. They're religious hymns, but they have all sorts of stories in them too. So it's the kind of document they are, the kind of stories they tell, is going to be quite varied. Uh, One noticeable thing about Hinduism is it's a polytheistic religion. At least that's one of the main interpretations. And there are many gods. As with most polytheistic approaches, we find that not all the gods are equal. Some are more important than others. Uh, and it seems in the Vedas that there's all sorts of different versions of this, and there's not much of a transition or explanation for moving from one to the other. Things just change. So at one point, the top god is Prajapati, and other gods are kind of secondary to Prajapati. Later on in the Vedas, it seems that uh, the whole idea of being polytheistic and the idea that there are many gods gets sort of submerged, and people move to the idea that really there's just one God. That God is a Brahman, and that God is not just one God. That God is the whole universe. Again, which is an idea which is a little bit confusing, I think, for people who are expecting their gods to be sort of separate from the universe. It's a sort of pantheistic view, the idea that the universe is God. So it's all a little bit kind of confusing, or at least there's a lot of stuff going on there. It doesn't seem that these views are necessarily consistent with each other. So then the question is, well, which is the right view? And some of them are somewhat tricky to make sense of. Looking at these different religious claims in these texts, there are philosophical issues that come out of them. One of the things we'll be trying to get a little clearer on is like, what's the difference between philosophy and religion? Is there a big overlap? I guess the basic idea, at least ideally, is that philosophy is based on reason, and so if for any philosophical claim, there should be an argument for that claim. There should be some reason to believe it. And so when it comes to these claims about different gods, one of the things we want to know is like, well, how do we know how many gods there are? Who's making these claims, and how do they know the difference between the different gods? If you're changing your view and you're saying there aren't many gods, or there's just one god, and all these other kind of previous gods are actually just sort of aspects of the one god, then how do you know the difference? Is there just language, or is there some way to kind of tell how many gods you have? So those are tricky questions, obviously, for any religious approach, because unless you just claim to have some sort of inspiration or divine knowledge, which is pretty mysterious, then it's going to be pretty hard to say how many gods there are and how do we kind of divide those things up. So that's a tricky issue. We can draw the distinction between metaphysical issues, which is about how do we actually, well, the question is like, what's the nature of the world? And then the epistemological issues, which is about knowledge. How do we know? And I guess what I was just actually talking about in the previous slide, I was mixing them up, or like it becomes very quickly clear that as soon as you raise an epistemological question about a metaphysical issue, you need an answer. And for any metaphysical claim, you need some way to back it up. So I guess the other issue that comes up, if the idea is that everything is God, then does that mean that things are not made of matter really, but rather everything is sort of spiritual in some way? Everything is some kind of godlike substance? And that's that's pretty mysterious. So one of the classic issues, certainly in Western philosophy, and I think also in Eastern philosophy, is how many kinds of substance are there? Is there a mental substance, a spiritual substance, a physical substance? Are these things governed by different laws of nature? These are kind of tricky issues. And we need to try and work out, well, how would we know the nature of mind? How would we know the nature of God? And how do we know the nature of matter? I mean, in the West, we are pretty sure that we have, and in fact, the whole world, we're pretty sure we have pretty good science, which tells us the nature of matter. With the whole story about atoms and molecules and them all building together. So we're pretty sure we know about that stuff. There's more questions about knowing the nature of mind or knowing the nature of the supernatural. So those are big questions to be discussed. This takes us then to the Upanishads. There seems to be different spellings, Upanishads. So these are part of the Vedas, but they're a late part, and they're more philosophical. There's more discussion of the philosophical ideas within the text among different participants with the stories. So the Upanishads give a kind of more of a philosophical basis for the kind of metaphysical claims in Hinduism. Again, the author who wrote them is not known, They were probably written sometime around between 700 and 300 BCE. Dating is a tricky process, but they are important texts for Hinduism. We aren't going to be looking at many of the Upanishads at all, but we will look at just one theme in them, which is the nature of the self. Sometimes we all use the word Atman, and which means something like self, soul, the essential nature of a person, something like that. This is addressed especially in the Chandogya Upanishad, and in that you have the god, the main god, Prajapati, teaching to characters who want to learn. There's Indra and Virochana. And I mean, it's got a complicated story. You can easily find summaries of this story elsewhere. I'm not going to go into it here. But the bottom line is that the nature of the self is hard to know. It takes many years of study, of self-discipline in order to get the insights, if you're going to know it truly. So it seems that knowing it from a short video is not going to give you any deep knowledge. It's just going to give you very surface knowledge. But the basic idea is that the self cannot be perceived directly. We can't have a direct knowledge of the self. And one thing to note is that the self is not the same thing as the body or anything physical. Rather, the self is something very non-material. And also, there's a claim that the self is eternal. So, I mean, those sorts of ideas that the self is eternal and non-physical, those ideas are similar to some ideas in Christianity. So I guess one question is, does eternal just mean it exists forever, or does it also mean that it goes back in time too, from the beginning of time? I'm not sure I know the answer to that one for Hinduism. But that's the kind of bottom line. It gives this very very highly theoretical concept of self. Not something which is part of our experience, but rather something that can be inferred from our experience when we carefully consider it. Another central part of Hindu thought is the idea of reincarnation, the cycle of birth, death, and then rebirth, and this is something which goes on throughout time. Sometimes we use the technical term samsara. And we can influence our future by leading a good life or leading a bad life. The idea of karma is that how you live now will have an effect on how you are reincarnated. The better you live now, the better your future life will be next time you are reborn. And if you lead a bad life, then your future life is more likely to be suffering. So there is this idea that your actions now have consequences. In Christianity, people are familiar with the idea of heaven and hell, the idea that you aren't reincarnated, but rather when you physically die, somehow you go into a different realm, and which realm you go into depends on how you live now. So it's a sort of similar idea with Hinduism and Christianity, although they're significantly different too. But the basic idea is that you can have an effect on what happens. One of the striking questions or issues for me is who decides your fate? And it seems that part of the idea is that it's related to the gods. So there's this idea that you will improve your life by pleasing the gods. And so certainly in a lot of Greek tragedy and other areas, this idea that the gods have an effect on your life. But we see similar ideas in the Hindu thought that by pleasing the gods, you will gain good karma. On the other hand, it also seems that sometimes that your future doesn't depend on the gods. It's just more like a law of nature, that how you behave now will have an effect on your subsequent life. And similarly, in ancient Greek culture, it does seem sometimes that the idea of your fate is not a matter of just what the gods decide, but somehow your fate is somehow written into like the future history, irrespective of the gods. So there's a little bit of a tension there about how important the gods are in your future, and is it just the gods or other elements as well? So it's an interesting parallel between the two there. All right, so one idea which is worth mentioning, and I sort of have already kind of mentioned it briefly, is the idea that we already talked about the idea that there's only one God, and that God is in fact the whole universe. But there's also an idea that consciousness is God, is Brahman, and is the whole universe. So that's it seems to be saying that consciousness is everything, and even including God, which is, to my mind, something that's the sort of idea you would have if you had been taking a lot of mind-expanding drugs. But it also seems sort of confused. I mean, just how could consciousness be the whole universe? It would just seem to be that there's too much in the universe for it all to be just consciousness. Unless we need to expand the idea of what consciousness is to be much greater than we currently think it is. So certainly this is an interesting idea to be explored, and one worry is whether it's even coherent, whether it even makes any sense. Moving on now, we can talk about the Buddha and Buddhism. The Buddha was a man, probably a real figure to some extent, known as Gautama Buddha or Siddhartha Gautama. He was probably born in Nepal in the 5th century BCE, at least that's what the traditions say. And you can look at biographies of him. There are all sorts of videos about him. And the basic idea is that he left his rich family, his aristocratic family, and became a wandering ascetic, rejecting all riches and all luxury. And he kind of gained great wisdom, and he left us with knowledge or beliefs which are at the heart of Buddhism. I guess one big question is, to what extent is Buddhism a religion rather than a way of life or a philosophy or a set of claims? Certainly there's big moral claims within Buddhism, and there's also a lot of sort of psychological claims, and there's not much or well, there's maybe some reference to gods, but it's not primarily an approach which depends on a belief on lots of supernatural entities, although it does assume the whole Hindu idea of reincarnation, of life, death, and rebirth. So it's not a completely sort of materialistic or physicalist view based simply on the laws of physics. It does have what would normally be thought of as supernatural views too. The Four Noble Truths are certainly an essential part of Buddhist teaching, and there's lots to say about them. They are translated in different ways by different people. Here's one translation. There's the idea of the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth to the path of cessation of suffering. Often, in some ways, the fast and loose approach to this is to say that life is suffering, that life, desire causes suffering. So the idea is that we lead lives which are full of pain because we have desires which can't be met. And then the sort of solution to that is to move to a life where you don't seek things that you can't have. And basically giving up on desire. So part of that is leading a very simple life. And there's a striking similarity there to some approaches by the Epicureans and by the Stoics to some extent. So there's an interesting comparison there. So I mean, I'm not going to go over all the truths, but the basic idea is we should aim for a life where we try to stop controlling things and we stop desiring to make our lives better in some ways by having desires, rather we give up desires. It's often thought of as quite a paradoxical view. There is a kind of question about to what extent does Buddhism say that morality is a separate realm or set of laws that we should follow morality because it's true. There is this idea that we should be moral, we should be good to people because that will actually reduce our suffering. Now there are different translations of this idea of the characteristics we should be aiming for. Sometimes they're called the four divine abidings. Sometimes there are other translations too. The one word to use is the Brahma Viharas. And these are kind of basically what we might think of as character traits, which we should instill in ourselves to have better lives. So this is the idea of loving kindness, the idea of compassion, the idea of sympathetic joy, and then equanimity. And there's a lot to say about all of those, and it's certainly very interesting to pursue a knowledge of that. But those are the basic ideas. The whole idea of the Noble Eightfold Path in some ways has similar features. The idea is that we are trying to end our suffering. And so there's the idea of the right view, just knowing the world in the right way, and then we have to have the right intentions, and we need to act well, so we have to have right speech and right action, and right livelihood or right living. There's right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, and then the development of wisdom. Again, there's probably different translations of those things, but that's kind of at least a rough sketch of what we're aiming for. None of that includes a lot of content, but it at least gives you a sort of structure, and there's a great deal of scholarship and thought behind each of those different elements. We're not going to be looking at all of them, but we will spend just a little time looking at the idea of a right view. Before we get to the idea of the right view, we should also mention the idea of nirvana. Nirvana is a distinctive idea in Buddhism. It's linked to the idea of reincarnation and suffering, but the idea is with nirvana, we end the cycle. The cycle of birth, death, and rebirth can be broken. But how do you do that? Well, you achieve nirvana. But what does that mean? I think there's a lot of different interpretations of what it means, and sometimes people think of it as just a final death where you no longer go on living, or it might mean your body dies, but somehow you reach a level of consciousness where you no longer keep on being reborn, or maybe it means something else. So there's a lot of debate about that. But one of the central ideas of Buddhism is that at least the truly enlightened can reach nirvana. One of the most interesting parts of Buddhism for a lot of Western philosophers is the idea that there is no self. Sometimes we use the phrase anatman. There's a lack of self. And the basic idea is that the self is an illusion. People who believe in the existence of a self or a soul or something essential are making a mistake. There's parallels within a lot of Western thought, especially the philosopher David Hume comes to mind with his bundle theory of self, which is again is a sort of anti-self view. But Hume kind of isn't really one to take metaphysics very seriously, so he's pointing out how metaphysics gets you into confusion and you should just live life, whereas the Buddhist view does take this very seriously and thinks there are major implications for how we should live. So the basic idea is that instead of there being some sort of real self, all we have is a collection of senses and thoughts, and these are called the skandhas. And exactly what to make of that is a big question, but the central idea is that we are making a mistake if we think there's really some substantial self that exists over time and continues. So if we take this idea seriously, then this should help us not to be concerned about our future self, because in some ways the whole idea of our self is more of a momentary thing which doesn't persist over time. Now, if you are going to take this idea seriously, then it's going to be pretty radical. And it seems, in fact, that it completely undermines the whole idea of reincarnation, which very much relies on the assumption that there is a persisting self which can go from body to body, which can exist in different physical forms. We talked before about the idea of some kind of enduring eternal self. So the traditional Hindu approach seems to very much assume that there is a self. And in some ways, the Buddhist approach also inherited that Hindu view. But here it also seems to undercut it and says, well, no, there is no such thing. But if there is no such thing, then how can we even make sense of reincarnation? Because what's being reincarnated? There is no self to be reincarnated. If the self is simply a momentary thing, then it doesn't persist over time. So that means you have to sort of try and re-understand the whole essentials of reincarnation and our ordinary ideas of self and how to live even. And what's the point in feeding our future selves if there is no such thing as a future self? The self is just a momentary thing. How am I related to the selves or the thoughts or the things that come later than me, if really what I am is just a momentary existence? So it's pretty confusing, I would say. And if you are going to take the idea of no self seriously, then you're going to have to do a lot of rethinking of other things. Finishing off, we can ask this question, is Buddhism philosophy or is it religion? We've already talked about how it lacks some of these sort of God parts of regular religion. Is it philosophy? Well, it has a bunch of claims about the nature of the world and about the nature of the self. And then the question is, well, does it have arguments for that? Well, obviously there are various writers within Buddhism who do make arguments, so it is kind of philosophical. But there's still a question about kind of how well do we actually understand these claims and how well can they be justified? And I think that's a question for deeper scholarship of Buddhist thought. But I mean, certainly there's an overlap between the philosophical parts of Buddhism and philosophical claims in other religions and generally in the Western philosophical tradition. So certainly there are interesting kind of comparisons to be made between the different views, and it's a very stimulating enterprise to kind of see how these different ideas have evolved and can compare over time.